2 minutes after the noon, so I think we can be starting. As I can see, we've got people that are like broadly connected with the Byzantine seminar here at the university, but also gathered representatives of the Students Association. Thank you for your being. And those ones that participated in the latest edition of Politics and Art note very much from the presentation. If you don't know, so you will be very much interested with her work and the person himself. Let me use something like basic information about our today's guest. So Claire Burridge is a historian of early medieval health and medicine. And she researches basically into textual things like textual transmission of short text we call recipes. It combines different things. We would see something like literary studies, but firstly, something like textual transmission. Archaeology, because the text usually covers something that is very physical, like, for instance, artifacts, yes, and usually something like Materia, Medica things that are very important to identify. And there is something which I don't know, and I hope you will explain to me and to us, because you also research into or you use biocodicological material, which is for me something that I don't know. Claire is now connected with the project, and the project goes on at the University of Oslo. So she arrived to us direct from Oslo, and the project is called Minitext. And this is those minitexts. These are usually recipes that are either a collection, but sometimes not. And the important is in which context they are found and what the context and the recipes itself about. Tell about the time, about society, and about everything, and of course in this about medical knowledge. She published, and it was this year, the first book with Brill, and the book is called, so it's entitled Carolingian Medical Knowledge and Practice, circa 775 up to 900, new approaches to recipe literature, and it's available in open access, so anyone who reaches what webpage can have access to it. I just wanted to mention that our guest is originally from North Carolina, where she got her bachelor degree at the University Chapel Hill, but then she moved to Cambridge, not Massachusetts, but Cambridge in the United Kingdom, where she got her MPhil and PhD. And she has held a number of positions, and now she is at the University of Oslo doing the project, which is minuscule texts, marginalized voices in early medieval Latin culture, 700 to 1000, and the acronym or something like that. This is this mini text. So, Claire, the floor is yours, and we are patiently awaiting the constants of your lecture.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Okay, yes, wonderful. I'll start seated since the mic is here, but I may jump up a few times to point things out. So I hope that's not too disruptive. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and just generally for inviting me to be participating in this Horizons of the Humanities series. I feel I have a pretty tough act to follow after Sean last week, so we'll see how this goes. But thank you also for everyone who's here attending, because I realize that early medieval pharmacy, especially from the Latin West, may not be everyone's cup of tea. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I hope, however, that I'll be able to demonstrate how the study of these types of Latin sources can be productively connected to a host of other research topics, while simultaneously opening up bigger picture questions about the movement of knowledge over time, across space, and between different cultures. So on that note, I'm going to jump right into an example, just to give you a flavor of what we'll be looking at today. So on the screen now, we have a recipe titled the Potio Pigmentaria ad omnes infirmitates, or a spiced potion to treat all infirmities. This recipe, found in a manuscript today held in Laon, is one of my favorites because it's both ordinary and extraordinary in several ways. On the one hand, it has a presentation of a fairly standard prescription. Its title states that it offers a broad but not atypical aim, so all infirmities. And it recommends, like many recipes, a mixture of ingredients ranging from potentially local herbal products such as dittany, birthwort, and fennel, to clearly non-local substances, including cinnamon, ginger, cloves, pepper, both long and black, myrrh, and frankincense. On the other hand, the recipe is quite extraordinary given its context. The rest of the manuscript has nothing to do with medicine. Rather, it contains the earliest surviving Latin version of the text of the Lateran Council of 649, a council that was convened by Pope Martin I in Rome to condemn the Eastern Christological belief known as monotheletism, so the doctrine that Christ has only one will. The manuscript also contains a number of related documents, such as a letter from Martin to Amandus, who was Bishop of Maastricht, with the council's canons, and instructions to convene a Frankish council. These magnificent pages open the codex, which I think even based on a black and white microfilm image, you can see was really quite a deluxe production, and not just any old manuscript to which a later reader might have added some personal notes, like our recipe. In terms of its date, the manuscript, which you can see here, has been dated to the second quarter of the 9th century, so between about 825 and 850, whereas our recipe looks like it was written a few generations later, between the late 9th and 10th centuries. This recipe, moreover, is located on an inserted half folio at the very end of the codex, which you might be able to tell from the slightly cut off bottom part. Naturally, this perplexing setting raises many questions regarding the spread of medical knowledge in the early medieval West, as well as contemporary reading and recording practices. But those are for another paper. So here I should note that if you are interested in hearing more about the presence of medical texts in unexpected manuscript contexts, then maybe join us tomorrow as well, because that's what I'll be talking more about. But let's return to these ingredients, because in addition to the standard mixture of ingredients I noted initially, which included a substantial selection of exotic Materia Medica, there are two exceptional ingredients, Zedoary and Galangal. Both of these are native to Southeast Asia, so that fits with some of the other ingredients I've already mentioned, such as cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. But there's a key difference. Whereas all the other non-local ingredients that are named in this recipe were recorded in earlier pharmaceutical writings, that is, recipes found in Greek and Latin recipe collections from antiquity, or at least late antiquity, neither Zedoary nor Galangal were recorded in these texts, or at least not using these terms and similar orthographic variants. Yet these two plants, which you can see on the screen, both of which are in the ginger family, do begin to appear in Carolingian manuscripts, though their appearances remain overall very rare. So the inclusion of these two ingredients is another way in which our recipe is exceptional. It is among the earliest wave of witnesses to the presence of pharmaceutical information concerning Zedoary and Galangal in the Latin West. It must be noted that it does not provide evidence for the actual arrival of these substances themselves, but this is a point to which we shall return. The key takeaway here is that this potion includes two newly recorded ingredients. And interestingly, by listing Galangal and Zedoary together, the recipe exemplifies one of the patterns that I've identified with respect to these types of newly introduced products. And this is also something we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So with this glimpse into the recipe literature, I'll now zoom out and provide a little bit more background in order to situate the research that I'll be sharing today. First, we'll consider the evidence base. The pharmaceutical texts on which I'll be concentrating are, like the opening example, medical recipes, or what today we think of as prescriptions. Early medieval medical recipes come in a wide range of formats, varying hugely in terms of their level of detail, complexity, and ingredients. And it's this final aspect, their Materia Medica, that will be central to today's talk. Although many of these recipes derive, whether directly or indirectly, from classical and late antique traditions, the surviving texts document a dynamic and evolving environment of medical learning. We see not only that older texts were being combined and recombined in new ways, but also the impact of various external influences. For example, some early medieval recipes, in contrast to their classical and late antique antecedents, incorporate ingredients directly linked to the church, such as holy water or chrism. At the same time, we also see the introduction of certain ingredients like beer that seem to have been related to the local environments in which these recipes were being recorded. What we'll be focusing on today, however, is at the other end of the Materia Medica spectrum, non-local, newly recorded ingredients. The manuscripts that I'll be sharing today are all written in Latin and were produced in intellectual centers around Western continental Europe, sites within the green areas of this map, or the Carolingian world. They date primarily to the 9th century, though they range from the late 8th to the 10th centuries. In some cases, we'll be looking at recipes found in the recipe collections of medical compendia, whereas in other cases, just like our opening potion, we'll be looking at recipes added to margins, flyleaves, and other blank spaces that were left within these manuscripts. I should note that with respect to such additions, I still use the year 1000 as a rough cutoff date, and this means that these added recipes were generally written no more than a few generations after the original manuscript was produced, and sometimes they were even added around the same time. So broadly speaking, we'll be examining Carolingian and immediately post-Carolingian pharmaceutical texts and related evidence. This is important to emphasize because we don't have nearly as many Greek medical texts from the early end of my chronological spectrum. But the ingredients that I've been tracing may help to shed light, if only indirectly, on the pharmacological information that was circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean during the centuries for which comparable manuscript evidence has not survived. Now, I should say just a few words about selecting and studying newly recorded Materia Medica. When I say Eastern pharmaceutical knowledge, I mean Materia Medica that was not local to Western Europe. It can, of course, be difficult to evaluate the idea of localness when we're thinking about such a large area, the Carolingian world, and one that had many different environments, not to mention varying levels of connectivity with its surrounding regions. A scribe working at St. Gall, an important monastic center between the Bodensee and the Alps, for example, may have been able to access alpine plants with relative ease, whereas Materia Medica produced around the Mediterranean may have been more difficult and expensive to acquire. On the other hand, a monk at Laon, a community located just off the French Riviera, may have experienced the very opposite. With this potential ambiguity in mind, the newly recorded Materia Medica that I'll be showcasing today all represent substances that could not have been grown, foraged, hunted, or produced in Western Europe, and instead originate further east, far beyond the peripheries of the Carolingian Empire, from Asia Minor to the Spice Islands of present-day Indonesia. As such, they represent unequivocally non-local substances that would have traveled over long distances and likely through many hands to reach the Latin West. I also want to acknowledge that these newly recorded ingredients have longer histories of use in non-Western traditions. I think this is important to keep in mind since the West is so often centered, especially in the context of the history of medicine, given the dominance of Western biomedicine today and how this has helped to shape the field. The early medieval West, however, as I think my paper today illustrates, was really just on the fringes of a dynamic network of trade and exchange grounded further to the east. So in short, while I'll be sharing examples of adaptation and innovation, it must be remembered that this stems from the adoption of and expansion on earlier non-Western traditions. And as a final word of introduction, I also have to acknowledge the work of a number of other scholars, such as John Riddle and Michael McCormick, who first argued that a handful of ingredients such as ambergris, camphor, and musk were introduced to the West around the 8th and 9th centuries, based on our earliest surviving records of these substances in Latin medical texts. By analyzing a substantially larger corpus of recipes, I have built on their work, not simply by identifying more instances of the ingredients they highlighted and recognizing the newness of several other ingredients, but also by tracing the patterns that emerge in the manuscript evidence and then exploring their significance with respect to the diffusion of pharmaceutical information, the evolution of recorded medical knowledge, as well as questions of connectivity linking East and West. So with this background in mind, we'll now return to the manuscript evidence. What other ingredients are appearing at this time, where, and how? Let's begin with a recipe found in the middle of a large recipe collection in Codex Anglensis 44. This composite manuscript, now held in St. Gall, is made up of two distinct and sizable halves. And the second half is a substantial medical manuscript that was produced in northern Italy in the second half of the 9th century. Sandwiched between two complex antidotes, we have a recipe titled Confectio Thymiame, or a preparation of incense. As I've argued elsewhere, the appearance of incense as an ingredient within medical recipes, as well as the occurrence of recipes for the preparation of incense in standard recipe collections, like this one in Codex Anglensis 44, indicates that in the early medieval West, incense was understood to be a multi-purpose substance with both liturgical and medicinal functions. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the ingredients of this recipe. This preparation calls for 12 different ingredients, all non-local. Some, such as storax, frankincense, and mastic, have been well attested in medical texts since antiquity. 5 ingredients, or nearly half of all of those listed, appear to be newly recorded in this period. So these are cosumber, confitum, camphor, musk, and ambergris. So what are these ingredients and where are they coming from? Cosumber and confitum, unlike the other ingredients, have yet to be confidently identified, but based on later sources, both of these products seem to be derivatives of storax. Storax, as I've already said, was long known and is listed as a separate ingredient in many incense recipes, including this one. But these two terms, cosumber and confitum, both begin to appear in Carolingian sources. Camphor is the aromatic extract from the wood of the camphor laurel, a tree native to island Southeast Asia, while musk and ambergris are unusual here as the only two animal products involved in this recipe, and both also have slightly more complicated histories. Musk, a secretion of the musk deer, a species native to the foothills of the Himalayas, appears to represent a reintroduced substance in the Latin West, though it was likely entirely new to the Frankish world. The first surviving attestation of musk in Latin occurs in Jerome's Adversus Jovinianum, which was written in the late 4th century. But this one example remains its only appearance until we begin to see it being recorded in recipes like this one in the Carolingian period. Finally, ambergris is a pungent substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales. Given that sperm whales are found in oceans all around the world, it can wash up essentially anywhere, including the North Atlantic. In fact, you sometimes see news reports today about people stumbling across a chunk of this floating gold just walking along a beach. However, for whatever reason, its use in pharmacy and related, potentially overlapping practices such as cosmetics and perfuming appears to have emerged in the East, meaning that its inclusion in 9th century recipes represents a new development in the Latin West that coincides with the introduction of these other ingredients. So to recap, this one recipe presents a remarkable clustering of newly recorded materia medica. Out of 12 ingredients, 5 are products that appear to have been introduced, or in the case of musk, reintroduced to the Latin West. But what's even more remarkable, or perhaps more exciting, is that this recipe is not alone. Far from it, in fact. This incense recipe is one of over 20 recipes that I've now identified that belong to a shared incense recipe tradition. I should note that there are other recipes for incense that were circulating during this period that do not rely on this cluster of newly recorded ingredients, or any newly recorded ingredients for that matter. So the witnesses within this family of incense recipes really do stand out, and tracing its diffusion offers an ideal opportunity to explore the transmission of newly introduced pharmaceutical knowledge. So I'll share a few more of these examples just to give you a sense of the bigger picture. First, here we have the Thymiama Paltgrimi, or Paltgrim's incense, which appears right at the bottom of this page under a sphere of life and death in Codex Anglensis 752, a medical manuscript produced in the second half of the 9th century, also in St. Gall. It presents a very simple recipe with only 5 ingredients: cosumber, confitum, aloes wood, musk, and camphor, 4 of which are newly recorded. The only one missing when compared to our previous example is ambergris. And now let's turn to a page from Codex Anglensis 878, the manuscript that has long been thought to have been the personal handbook of the Carolingian scholar Walafrid Strabo, though this has recently been questioned. Here, immediately following a page of other medical recipes, we have 2 different incense recipes. Both are presented as simple lists, and although the first is untitled and the second begins with item aliter, based on their ingredients, it's clear that they belong to the same family of incense recipes. And I realize it may be hard to see where the different recipes are. The first third, and the second is the bottom 2/3. In this case, the 2 recipes present a short and long version. Notably, both versions include all 5 of the newly recorded ingredients. And then for one more example from St. Gall, consider Codex Anglensis 899, a late 9th century poetry anthology to which readers in the 10th century added a number of different sections of recipes, one of which we're now looking at. Here we have not 1, not 2, but 3 different variants of the same incense recipe tradition. Like the 2 recipes in Codex Anglensis 878, these 3 recipes rely on the same group of ingredients, which again include the 5 newly introduced ingredients, but each recipe here varies in the specific quantities that are listed and combine different extra ingredients in addition to this core group. For example, the first one doesn't include spikenard like the other 2, though it does feature mastic, which then isn't found in the others. But I don't want you to think that this is a tradition exclusively associated with St. Gall, because that's certainly not the case. Here, we're looking at a flyleaf from a codex now housed in Cambridge, Corpus Christi College, manuscript 223. Thought to have been originally produced at Saint-Vaast in the 3rd quarter of the 9th century, the manuscript moved to Saint-Bertin soon after its composition. From here, it appears to have relocated to England, possibly brought by Grimbald of Saint-Bertin when he arrived in the 890s at the request of King Alfred. While the bulk of the codex consists of a range of non-medical texts, such as works by Prudentius, over the following generations, its readers added all kinds of other material to its blank spaces. And this includes the 4 recipes that you can see on this page. These were written by 3 different scribes, and the first recipe, though possibly all 4, appears to predate the manuscript's arrival in England. And it's this first recipe, titled Confectio Thymiamatus, that is of interest to us, since it represents another incense recipe variant. I've shared this mobile manuscript's backstory because I wanted to point out that incense recipes traveled. Although this one was probably written in Saint-Bertin, it soon moved to England. Moreover, even if the other recipes on this same page were also written on the continent, some were glossed in Old English, indicating that insular readers were engaging with the material added to this flyleaf. In other words, not only by tracing the appearance of recipes recorded at different centers of manuscript production, can we follow the movement of pharmaceutical knowledge. In this case, we've seen that we can also track a manuscript's journey and think about how the information it contained was shared more widely. And there's one other reason that makes this corpus example particularly noteworthy. It's recently been in the news. So if anyone is interested in incense recipes, or more generally in the replication of medieval recipes, a team at Cambridge actually prepared this very recipe and tested it. And it even made the BBC and everything. So you can Google it, find out more. But clearly, incense is a hot topic. Before returning to Galangal and Zedoary, I do want to share one last example of this incense recipe tradition. And I promise it is my last one, but I think I've shared the best, or I've saved the best for last. We're looking at a folio near the end of a manuscript now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This is Parasinas Latinus 11219. This major medical compendium is thought to have been produced at Saint-Denis in the middle of the 9th century. This page, however, is a bit different. While I realize it might be difficult to see on the slide, there are at least half a dozen different hands involved. So what's been written by all of these different scribes? You've probably already guessed, but in case you haven't, more incense recipes. This single folio features an impressive 12 different variants that all belong to the same shared incense tradition. So here's just a close-up of 3 of the recipes, so starting here, here, here. And so you can see that, again, they include the same core cluster of newly recorded ingredients. Many of the scripts appear to be closely related, though they span several generations, suggesting that incense recipes were added to this folio over time. That is, we can see the community at Saint-Denis building up a collection of incense recipes between the late 9th and 10th centuries. This growing corpus testifies to an active scriptorium where scribes continue to engage with and add to manuscripts over the years, recording the latest iterations of a common incense tradition. Having now shared an overview of this distinctive incense recipe tradition, I'll turn to the other ingredient cluster that I've identified, Galangal and Zedoary. In total, I found 24 recipes that feature Galangal and 18 with Zedoary. And in more than half of these recipes, including our opening Pozio Pigmentaria, Galangal and Zedoary are listed together. So again, our 2 favorite. Oh. So like the opening example, here we have another case of a recipe added to a non-medical manuscript. This codex, today housed in Stockholm, was produced around the year 876 and primarily contains a Gregorian sacramentary. Between the end of the 9th century and the first half of the 10th century, a scribe added a series of recipes to the margins of its opening folio. So it's probably a bit hard to see, but all the way around the top and bottom margins, there are recipes. We're now going to zoom in on the lower margin of folio 2 recto. In a potion to treat omnem gutam, the first 2 ingredients are Zedoary and Galangal. While the rest of the recipe is fairly hard to decipher, it doesn't look like any other newly recorded ingredients are mentioned. Now, staying in Sweden, we're moving to a well-known medical compendium held in Uppsala, though it's thought to have been produced in Italy. This is Universitätsbibliotheca C664. While most of the manuscript dates to the 3rd quarter of the 9th century, the small quire that you can see on the screen was inserted a bit later. It dates to the late 9th or 10th centuries. This quire, covering pages 85 to 100, is mostly filled by a single recipe collection, within which there are multiple recipes that include Galangal and Zedoary, such as this lectuary, where the 2 ingredients are again listed side by side, and then immediately followed by a series of similarly exotic but better known ingredients such as ginger, balsam wood, cinnamon, and cloves. In another electuary, just a few pages earlier, this is the Electuarium dia Decameron, we can see a similar case, though here the 2 ingredients are separated by one pellitory. Now, another Paris manuscript presents a comparable example. Like the Uppsala compendium, this medical manuscript is thought to have been produced in Italy though it dates to the very end of my chronological spectrum, as it was written in the late 10th century. While the manuscript is best known for its copy of Celsus de Medicina, it also contains a number of other short texts and extracts, including several sections of recipes that are organized by their type of preparation, such as oils, plasters, and electuaries. Intriguingly, it is again in a section of electuaries that the Galangal-Zedoary pairing is especially concentrated. So within just an 8-folia section of the manuscript, Galangal is listed in 9 different recipes and Zedoary in 7. In the majority of cases, the 2 ingredients are named together. So these pages just present a small sample. Here we have Galangal and Zedoary together in a recipe. Here, Galangal and Zedoary in neighboring recipes. And then one more time, Galangal and Zedoary next to each other. Although Galangal and Zedoary tend to cluster, as the middle image here illustrates, they are also sometimes found individually and as the only newly recorded ingredient in a recipe. In another Paris manuscript, for example, we find Galangal is the only newly recorded ingredient in a recipe titled Potio Mirabilis contra omnes infirmitates, so a marvelous potion against all infirmities. And this title might sound quite familiar because it's very, very similar to our opening example, that spiced potion for all infirmities. But this recipe is actually entirely different and seems to be unrelated. This case is also striking because it represents one of our very earliest witnesses. The manuscript, thought to have been produced in Burgundy, has been dated to the late 8th or early 9th centuries. And now let's turn to Zedoary. In a recipe that was added in the late 9th or 10th centuries to a manuscript today held in Bern, this is Berger Bibliothek Codex 109, Zedoary, in this case, is the only newly recorded ingredient. In contrast to the incense cluster, where we traced the same group of ingredients appearing in the variants of a single recipe tradition, you might have noticed that the recipes featuring Galangal and/or Zedoary have covered a much wider range of material. Although a few have had similar titles, we actually haven't seen any repeated recipes. This Bern recipe, a powder against poisons, is, however, the one exception. I've identified nearly identical versions of the powder, both of which include Zedoary, in 2 other manuscripts. In these cases, the other recipes are also additions, though they're slightly earlier and date to the mid or second half of the 9th century. Most significantly, the 3 manuscripts to which these similar recipes were added were all produced in the Paris region. So this suggests that we're witnessing a particular recipe that was shared locally. So having now reviewed examples of newly recorded ingredients and touched on a number of patterns that have emerged in the data, I want to highlight 3 key findings. The first, which I hope this overview of the manuscript evidence has made clear, is that we tend to see newly recorded Materia Medica appearing in clusters. In other words, more often than not, when one new ingredient appears in a recipe, there will be at least another one involved too. And looking at the distribution of ingredients, we can see 2 major ingredient clusters. On the one hand, the 5 newly recorded ingredients found in the incense recipe tradition, and on the other hand, the pairing of Galangal and Zedoary. What's striking is that these 2 clusters seem to capture 2 different ways that Eastern pharmaceutical knowledge was adopted and absorbed in the Latin West. The incense tradition shows the circulation of a single recipe, though we should keep in mind that it could have been introduced to the West multiple times and at multiple sites. Regardless, it's evident that these 22 recipes are all part of the same family. This is in contrast to the Galangal and Zedoary cluster, where we've seen a much larger range of recipes that incorporate these 2 ingredients. To me, the relative diversity of the Zedoary-Galangal pairing suggests that although the 2 ingredients may have been perceived as being linked, they were more readily incorporated into early medieval Latin pharmacy. That being said, each of the 5 newly recorded ingredients in the incense tradition are also found in a handful of cases outside of incense recipes, just as Zedoary and Galangal are sometimes found individually. These very rare examples may offer, at least in some cases, a window onto the adaptation of existing pharmaceutical knowledge and a deeper integration, deeper integration of Eastern influences. For instance, I've identified two versions of an antidote based on colocynth, the Antidotum diacholoquintidis, that, unlike earlier versions, includes camphor. Perhaps this documents a community's experimentation with these new substances. Are we seeing a community updating their texts with the latest cutting-edge pharmacy? And this brings us to the second pattern. The manuscript evidence documents a marked increase in the appearance of these ingredients over time. Consider the final examples that I shared of the Galangal-Zedoary pairing. The electuary sections in the Uppsala and Paris manuscripts. In both cases, these sections include multiple recipes with Galangal and Zedoary within just a few pages, and they are both on the much later end of the chronological spectrum we've considered. Likewise, I think it's important to note that a fair number of the examples of newly recorded ingredients appear as additions to other manuscripts. While the original codices may date to the early and mid-9th century, many of the additions were recorded in the late 9th and 10th centuries. There are, of course, a handful of early examples, such as the late 8th or 9th century Paris medical manuscript with a recipe that had Galangal, but these are truly exceptional. The folio with 12 incense recipes also speaks to change over time, though in a somewhat different way. While overall, the manuscript evidence documents a gradual increase in the frequency with which these ingredients were integrated into Latin prescriptions, this single page bears witness to an individual community expanding their arsenal of incense recipes over several generations. I would suggest that this may reflect a very practical need to adapt the relative quantities of ingredients in relation to their availability, a point to which I shall return momentarily. In the other cases where multiple variants were recorded together, they were all added at the same time by a single hand. So while this doesn't capture the more experimental flavor of the page with 12 recipes, I think it still suggests that communities needed or felt the need to have multiple options on hand. And now the final point that I must raise or must emphasize is that although I've shared a lot of examples, I know this has been a bit of a whirlwind, this remains overall a very limited phenomenon. We're looking at just a few dozen recipes against a backdrop of quite literally thousands. So with these patterns and points in mind, I'll now turn to the wider implications of this material, as well as the question of whether these ingredients were simply newly recorded or newly introduced. In other words, do we only have evidence for the movement of pharmaceutical knowledge, or are there signs that these substances also arrived in the West during this period? First, I would argue that the repeated clustering of ingredients may point to their shared origins. That is, the introduction of particular parcels of pharmaceutical knowledge to the Latin West in the early Middle Ages that then continued to be reconfigured and ultimately integrated into existing traditions within this new setting. By shared origins, however, I don't mean to suggest a simple, straightforward route of transmission. Rather, it seems likely, especially if we consider the words themselves, that this was a complex, multi-layered process. Focusing on the core ingredients of the incense recipe, several of the terms have Arabic origins, which themselves may come from other languages closer to each substance's point of origin. To give just one example, the Latin for camphor, caphora or casphora, is from the Arabic kafor, which in turn is from the Malay kapur. On the other hand, confitum seems to be a Latinized version of the Greek gumfitus. So does this suggest that the Latin versions of the incense recipes that use these core ingredients stem from a Byzantine incense tradition rather than, say, trade or gift exchange with the Abbasid Caliphate? Presumably, given the Arabic influence on some terms, a Greek source would have also drawn on trade and other exchanges with the Islamic world. That the Latinized Greek timiama or timiama generally appears in the title of these recipes also points to the influence of the Greek East with respect to this distinct parcel of pharmaceutical information. So based on the combination of ingredients and terminology, I would tentatively suggest that this incense recipe arrived in the Latin West via Byzantine sources. Sources that had absorbed information and acquired ingredients from the Islamicate world. And this multi-step process fits with the wider geopolitical dynamics of the period, as we'll see in a minute. At the same time, it's important to remember that when we encounter newly recorded ingredients appearing outside of this family of incense recipes, it seems that we may be seeing individual snapshots that show incrementally how these new products were integrated into Latin pharmacy over time. These are glimpses into a gradual process, demonstrating how older traditions were updated with newly available Materia Medica. So these points relate to the question of whether these products were actually available. While we don't have time to go into much detail here, various other written records outside of medical texts do in fact provide evidence for the introduction and circulation of the substances themselves during this period, if only sporadically, in small quantities, and generally limited to very elite circles. So to give just a very brief overview, not only do some somewhat general records, such as the Royal Frankish Annals, emphasize the exotic substances sent by Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne, but letters between a number of churchmen testify to the movement of some of these very products, such as Cosumber. That Cosumber specifically comes up in records of ecclesiastical gift exchange, fits especially nicely with the significant role that it plays in the incense recipe tradition. Furthermore, by the late 9th century, there's even a surviving shopping list, we could say, that records what the monks of Corbie intended to buy at the market at Cambrai. And this also names some of these new products. While we don't know if these monks were successful, it at least shows that they expected to be able to buy products like Galangal and Zedoary, alongside more traditional exotics such as pepper. And of course, I also think it's interesting to see that both of these terms are named, and so it's maintaining their parent even outside of medical texts. All of this is to say that there is evidence that these newly recorded ingredients were in fact potentially available in the West at this moment in time. And the evidence points most strongly to their presence in, unsurprisingly, elite and ecclesiastical communities, the very same communities that produced the manuscripts that contain these medical recipes. With that in mind, the long-term increase in the appearance of these ingredients, whether in clusters or individually, seems to reflect not simply the spread of information from distant sources, but also the more direct contact with the substances in question. Of course, the scribes responsible for the individual recipes we've seen might not have had any hands-on experiences with these ingredients, but I would suggest that someone in their wider orbit probably did. What I find quite significant here is that these manuscripts are documenting a change that is at once small, but also quite monumental. In terms of the sheer numbers, the introduction of new Materia Medica may look entirely inconsequential. Again, we're talking about just a few dozen recipes within a sea of thousands. Yet this development speaks to wider patterns of trade, communication, and exchange. That these substances, as well as information about their use in pharmacy, are beginning to arrive in the Latin West in the 8th and 9th centuries, depended on a constellation of factors playing out far beyond the rough edges of the Carolingian world. I would suggest that changing trade networks and increasing contact in the East played a critical role in the movement of these newly recorded ingredients. And here, I'm thinking especially about the evidence that we have for trade between China and the Islamicate world. If those interactions were expanding and thus facilitating the wider trade in these sorts of exotica, at roughly the same time that various developments in and around the Mediterranean and the West necessitated diplomatic exchanges and or led to the movement of certain groups of people, just take the period of Byzantine iconoclasm as one example, we can see how previously unrecorded Materia Medica may have reached the far ends of Western Europe during this period, if only slowly, sporadically, and in small quantities. Ultimately, then, these recipes featuring newly introduced ingredients offer a tiny glimpse from the backwaters of Western Europe onto more global dynamics of trade and knowledge exchange. So to wrap up, I'd like to end with one final point about the significance of these findings. I think this small burst in newly recorded ingredients hasn't received too much attention in the scholarship to date, in part because it's so easily overshadowed by the much more dramatic changes that followed soon after with the translation of Arabic texts into Latin in the 11th century and beyond. This translation movement is well known for its rapidity. The newly translated texts spread extremely quickly. Within just a few decades, Latin translations of Arabic medical texts could be found all around Europe. My understanding, though this is outside of my chronological comfort zone, is that this rapidity has often been seen as somewhat surprising. How and why were these texts picked up quite so quickly? I would suggest that the dissemination of these translations may have been helped by the foundations laid by the preceding generations. As we've seen, some pharmaceutical information from Eastern sources had already entered and was circulating in the West. Moreover, the increasing frequency with which these newly recorded ingredients were included in recipes suggests that they were growing in popularity and/or perhaps even becoming increasingly available. This background could have helped to create ideal communities of knowledge and practice into which Constantine the African's translations landed, facilitating the rapid uptake and continued diffusion of these texts. Now, I certainly don't mean to minimize the impact of the translation movement. That's a truly watershed moment in comparison to the small trickle that I've shared today. But I do think that this trickle may have helped to open the floodgates, to use a very watery metaphor. And so on that note, I'll end here, and I just want to acknowledge the funding bodies who have made this possible, and especially the mini-text project that I'm currently attached to. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you for this presentation, and hopefully there are questions or comments on the presentation.
Yes, in the beginning, I would like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. I think that your research area is partially connected to the one I would like to concern the future, namely early medieval magic.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, yes.
And we know that using herbs or healing is often treated like a magical practice. And due to this fact, I would like to ask you, did you notice in the sources which you worked on any examples of incantations or maybe conjuring formulas?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. Yes, is the short answer. Yes, definitely. And that's actually something that the mini-text project, it's really exciting, the sheer number of incantations that this project has been encountering, because they do seem to be added to margins and fly leaves in totally unexpected places. So there have been quite a few identified through this project that are otherwise not known in the scholarship. So watch this space. There should be a database being made available down the line. So I hope that will help with your research. And what excites me is sometimes seeing how recipes and incantations, charms, how these different sort of approaches to healing practices or protective practices are often intertwined and seem to sometimes blur together. And so you might have something that starts out like an incantation and is adjuring someone or includes various rituals. And then at the end, it's just a really simple recipe. And so it's just to see how these different kinds of layers of healing approaches come together and seem to work in symbiosis and just, yeah, thinking through the puzzles. So yes, in short, there are many incantations.
Yes, yes, I have similar impressions. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Please,
I can, well, yeah.
Could we return to the previous slide? No, because you gave us conclusions. Ingredients and clubs shared origins, meaning that they come from the same country or they were transported this way in the same way, or both at the same time.
It's very tricky. Thank you for this. I hesitate to provide a single answer here, but I think that the routes by which ingredients and knowledge about them may be coming in probably gets funneled. And so although certain products may not actually originate from the same sort of place, they might be transported together and so eventually end up arriving together.
Okay.
So at their destination, it might look like they have a shared origin, even if they don't originally. But I think in some cases, they might have shared origins, Galangal and Zedoary, maybe moving together. And so that might explain why they're consistently linked if they're coming from the same place originally. But that, yes, so that's, it's a, shared origins is probably not a good way to phrase it because it's
I'm not understand.
Too ambiguous.
Integration of ingredients individually, adaptation and experimentation. You mean that they were included for the reason, and the reason was experiment and its result. So it worked, yeah?
Potentially.
So, yeah.
I guess whether something worked depends on who's asking and what result they wanted.
Okay.
So
experimental experience of those that conducted the experiments. Yeah.
But I guess what I would suggest is that in contrast to seeing a set group that just moves together, when we see just one of these ingredients ending up in a recipe that we have earlier variants of, and to me that would suggest it. Once we have the evidence that shows that some of these products may have been actually circulating, if only very small amounts, then perhaps that shows that people were thinking, oh well, if I'm using this in X, then maybe I could replace Y in some ingredient and use it here because it's fairly similar, and so then it's sort of being more integrated. But whether or not it worked. So.
I'm just thinking about something like theoretical basis.
Yes.
From Galen, you would have had something like really scientific and theoretic grounds why you use something or not. And of course, you had a way out in case when you hadn't had something at your disposal, that you can use something that can substitute. So basically a substitute, then Galen would give you something like lists of substitutes, then there was like spread that everybody knew that should be, that we use something that's similar. And sometimes you get increase the amount of or decrease or something like that, but basically it should work like that. So it seems logical, yeah. So but do you think that it was like pure experience, or there was something like theoretical basis that were known, so that for instance people use something like the Galangal theory of 4 elements, temperaments, and so on and so on. For instance, the Simplicio.
Right. Oh, thank you for that question. That's very tough because.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because when you I've got no experience, but for instance, when you look into works that say something about like transmission, textual transmission. So usually what was in the, for instance, the 5th century, I was interested in something like that, writing about Antinous.
Yeah.
So, and Ravenna, you you didn't have something like very complex knowledge, but you got something that are basics like the sects or I don't know. Now I can't recall, but very basic things that are easy to comment on in Latin, not very much complex and not that much going into details about what Materia Medica is and how complex it is, but like giving you something that is already known or something like what runs in the blood, meaning that you can intuitionally easily accept the knowledge.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard about something like something really complex, something really theoretical.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think we are lacking that type of theoretical text. And so to what extent there is still tacit knowledge about some of these ideas about combinations of things and working within Galenic theories, whether that was still being passed down, but we just don't have any surviving texts speaking to that. So was a product like Camphor thought about in relation to those theories, whether more complex or simplified version, or whether it was someone more empirically experimenting? I think I wouldn't want to rule out any.
May I have that?
Please. Yeah.
The first information on Galangal and Zedoary, how do you pronounce the other Zedoary?
Zedoary.
Zedoary. You found in Western texts. Did you? Were you looking for something like that? Yes.
Yes.
And it was the first one which you showed us.
That's not the earliest.
No.
So that
the earliest is
the earliest.
If you remember roughly.
It's the earliest
for instance, 7th century, 8th century.
Probably late 8th century. So the Galangal, the first recipe here, I think that's the earliest.
And you think that it goes to west from the east?
Yes.
So it should be through Greek tradition.
Exactly. And so this is something that I've talked to.
Because I haven't counted Galangal. The problem is.
Well, this is something that I've talked to Petros Boros Laonatos about.
I just remember his article about
sugar.
Semen sets. No.
Oh, so, okay.
And he has like introduction, and then he said that, for instance, some things were like bakeries or what else? I don't
Musk,
remember.
maybe
that he introduced for the first time. And no, it isn't true, because you've got the terms that are in Oribasius, Aetius, definitely. Yeah? So we have, for instance, I was very cautious saying that he endorsed characterizations, because in fact we don't know when they were introduced. For the first time in the history of medical texts, we've got them testified to with the witness of the first use, but we don't know if he effectively was the first one that gave the characterization or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, completely. And so this is where it feels like we have some bits of a puzzle, but we're missing many puzzle pieces.
It's like seems logical that it should have come from the east, but not necessarily. There is something like urban or scholarly legend that something must have come, and sometimes it turns out that it wasn't so.
Absolutely,
especially necessarily, but I think that it's definitely logical.
Well, the what I was talking about with Petros most recently was also the word Zedoary, because he thinks that might be Greek.
What?
The different variants that we see in terms of how it appears in Latin. He was kind of thinking that there might be.
Okay. But was he sure?
No. This is all just, guys. Please don't quote me on this. But and then I don't remember his thoughts on Galangal specifically. But what we were talking about is that because so many of the Greek medical texts really pick up again more in the 10th century, I guess. So these Latin ones are just a few generations earlier. for a period that we don't have the equivalent Greek material surviving. And so, if we had Greek texts from the same period, would they be very similar? Would we see the same incense recipe? Would it? And so it's
no, it's obvious that they would have included here because stigmam is basically a Greek word.
exactly.
And for what the very first concept that all those epidemics must come by inhalation, they must be present in. So the changes introduced to the qualities of the air must have been important. So that's why stigmata are often, and if something is called stigma, it doesn't have to say that it was used for like an incense.
Right.
Because you got this normal, regular word epithet, say, none, used as an epithet, soltiniama.
Yeah.
But in a very different use, for instance, in a multi-ingredient deodorant.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. And of course, your last conclusion saying that it was a period of preparation for something that would have happened in the future. Exactly something like once again Ravenna and those early interest in something like dietetics. What you should eat and Antimus with his things, which is funny because he uses it and ginger and custard.
Exactly.
And even as I clean touchpad, for instance.
Okay.
Because he's got something like polio.
Okay.
Which might be something that comes from Sichuan, so as far as from China. But okay, excellent. I mean, thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Very new method, using very traditional one, but coming to very different effects and like an eye opener. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I can also answer your opening question about biocodicology if we have a minute. I don't know.
It's good.
Yes. So this is a new technique, and it's bridging manuscript studies with the archaeological sciences. So it's really, I think, revolutionary. It's incredible, but it's a non-invasive way to sample manuscripts and to treating manuscripts not just as reservoirs of text, but also as reservoirs of biological information. And so, I mean, just think about manuscripts. They're all organic materials,
okay,
and so you can.
So from the paper? No.
So the parchment,
yes,
exactly,
the parchment.
exactly. So by sampling the parchment with this, it's a technique that actually works with conservators.
No?
Not quite. So it's really simple. You can use an eraser. I mean, don't try this at home, but the technique is essentially you just use an eraser, and so as if you were trying to clean a manuscript, trying to clean the surface of a page, that eraser, anytime you use an eraser, there's a bit of crumb that has trapped tiny fragments of the surface of the parchment. So if you collect those fragments, you then put them in a test tube, do some fancy tests on them. And through that, you can analyze both genetic material and proteins. And then that can tell you all sorts of things, species identification. It can tell you about things that are on the surface of the manuscript. So in my case, I'm excited about whether anything was ever spilled on these manuscripts, or did people have sticky fingers when they were turning the page? And it's all of that. So it's there's huge potential.
It turns out that they drank coffee, for instance.
Yes, if we find that, then I think we know there's been an oops. But that's biocodicology.
Thank you so much once again, and thank you for this explanation.
Thank you.
So if we have no other comments, so we can.
I will have a short one, if I may. Thank you for fascinating and very clear presentation. I waited for a more important question from the mainstream of the subject because mine would be a side one. By the way, I'm still taken aback by the fact that Galangal appeared so early as in late antiquity anywhere in Europe. Now I know more through your discussion because Galangal is like a very a la mode now.
Yeah, trendy.
And everything, and everyone is treating it as something very new, very fresh.
Yeah.
And still with a name which is not very deviated from what we now use, appears, as you so clearly depicted in the manuscripts. But my question would be about Zedoary.
Yeah.
Because it was also used, so it appears, as a spice.
Mm-hmm.
And later it was rarer and rarer, and it was rather pushed from the market by ginger and turmeric. Do we know why? Because people started to feel that it's not that tasty, or some medical authorities said that it may have negative side effects, or because it's genus curcuma at the same time, yes? And if we go one systematic layer above, it's also close to ginger.
Yeah.
So we are within the same group. But anyway, I may put a mark now and let you answer if you have any even guesses, not necessarily something you deeply research, because I realize that the mainstream of your research is something else.
No, thank you.
Opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I hadn't actually thought about that before, about how Zedoary has perhaps phased out, whereas something like ginger just remains incredibly popular, and especially for culinary things. Galangal now perhaps on the rise, but why something might have phased out, I don't know. But I mean, off the top of my head, I wonder, in terms of the range of where some of these products are found, the ease of collecting them, shipping them. I mean, they're all roots, so I imagine that they have similar sort of long-term storage properties, but perhaps Zedoary goes off sooner. I mean, I'm just wondering about different factors that might be involved in.
I'm asking just because, we are having like 2 months seminar now.
Yeah.
And for me, Zedoary is not a case like Silphium.
Yes.
Yes, and even through Sally Granger and Christopher Brockhoff lecture here, it appears that Silphium never entirely disappeared. It just disappeared in Serini, and those surroundings that would be the best known. But it's not the case of Zedoary.
Right.
Because it was to be found.
Yeah.
In quite a variety of places.
Yeah.
So this is something like, I just like cooking and I love spices.
Yeah.
I have a lot of them at home. And of course, it's, every lecture and every meeting with scholars is also a kind of surprise. I didn't know that Asafoetida has so many varieties. And there are so many plants of that family. But it's not now something really known as a spice.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a matter to my taste, like with the early modern era that you had to, or in medieval times that you had to go afar, pay a lot of gold or precious metals for some grams, because Zedoary would be more available. So it's my just open question. Was it about the taste, or somebody said, probably if somebody said that it's negative or it would start disappear from manuscripts, you would notice.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything negative written about it, but if things later were written, then I wouldn't know, I must confess. So it's entirely possible that later authors thought, no, this isn't quite right. Or if it just fell out of fashion with changing tastes for whatever reason. So have you actually tried Zedoary? Does it?
No.
Okay, because
yes.
Maybe that will reveal why it went out of fashion.
Not yet. And in fact, your lecture prompted me to try to try harder to use it or find any recipe.
Yeah.
In the West, or perhaps I had to ask my boss whether he encountered any recipes in the East that would use it.
Yeah.
May I tell you the last question? Do you remember something like Materia, or Western Materia Medica book in which Zedoary and the Galangal are characterized in a Eastern way.
Right.
So, like the list of what qualities
Mhm.
it has, what conditions can be treated with it, something like that.
Yeah. So it doesn't appear in any types of early medieval herbals.
Okay.
So I should check later ones though, because the history of
Words, but means from which century?
well, I think that at least some of the Arabic ones that are not too much later than this material
Okay.
would
So
have
after
it.
the
Ibn
11th
Jujul,
century.
yeah. And so I need to check that, and then certainly in some of the much later herbals that continue to circulate in, say, early modern period. But yeah, so I haven't looked into the later
So,
tradition.
Anyway, up to the year 1000,
Mhm.
You haven't spotted anything like that.
Not
when
in
we're
a
going
herbal
through the
tradition.
text?
No, not in Latin.
Any other comments or questions? If not, we can say thank you and applaud once again.
Thank you all for coming out on a dreary day, and
It was a pleasure.